Fighting against injustice across Connecticut, Melissa in the Morning checks in with the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. Now on WICC 600 AM and 107.3 FM.
Many people hear the term DEI, which stands for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. DEI gets thrown around a lot, I would say, in the news. I mean, especially now leading up to the presidential election. You've probably heard at the federal level, the Republican Party many times, for example, calling Vice President Kamala Harris a DEI hire to most likely face Donald Trump in November. But it was really last summer, I felt, that DEI really took center stage after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled to end affirmative action in college admissions. So let's take a look back, because DEI is certainly not a recent phenomenon. It's actually been around for decades. What is the history, and how has it become so controversial in today's world? Kim Jacobsen joins the show at the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities to dive into today's topic. Hey, Kim, how are you?
Good. How are you, Melissa? Well, you just went right there, huh?
I had to go right into it. I have to be honest, Kim. It's interesting because just to give people a little bit of background, I have to say our partnership with the Commission on Human Rights over the last couple of years has been, more than that, has been really great. Tanya Hughes, the whole team there, they do a really great job of sending topics over. And I will say Tanya sends over the topics weeks, sometimes months in advance. This was a topic that she sent over, I want to say, in late June, early July. So this was well before we ever knew what was going to happen with the presidential election. But, correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, we hear DEI thrown around, I feel like, all the time in national news in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I feel like it's been thrown around a lot in the last couple of years.
Yes.
And it made me think, where did it come from? And I thought people would be interested in getting a little of the history about it.
Yeah,
so,
I love that.
So DE&I, like you said, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's really, for the most part, we're talking about in the workplace, an organizational system with the goal of treating people fairly. It's that simple. And it particularly focuses on people who have been historically underrepresented and or discriminated based on their identity or disability. And it really took a lot of momentum from the 60s civil rights movement. And it was basically, we want to treat people fairly. That's really where this comes from. But in the 60s, a lot of legislation was passed mandating what we call equal treatment. So you had in 1963 the Equal Pay Act, which was addressing pay disparities between the sexes. In 1964, Title VII was passed, the Civil Rights Act, which made it illegal to discriminate regarding things like hiring and firing. And it was principally enacted to deal with racial discrimination and segregation. And then in 67, you had the Age Discrimination Act, which primarily was used to address older workers. They set the bar at 40 or over, which seems so young to me right now. Following these laws, there was this really intense push to have companies comply with the laws, because you don't want to have laws that you're going to get in trouble for violating. And so they started training programs. And the first workplace diversity training programs emerged in the 60s with the ideas that employees are going to need to have to adjust to a more integrated workplace, because there was a lot of workplaces in the 60s that really were all white. And all of a sudden you were going to have, primarily Black, Hispanic employees coming in. And they felt that was going to be a real shock to the white workers. And so they wanted to put some training in place. And then you also had things like affirmative action plans starting to be implemented. In 1961, President JFK, John F. Kennedy, issued Executive Order 10925, which required government contractors to take some kind of affirmative action, some step to ensure that applicants were employed and treated equally, regardless of race, creed, color, or national origin. So these initial DE&I trainings were started with the do's and don'ts to make people feel comfortable, like don't say negative racial words, don't say negative things about women, very kind of basic trainings that were trying to show people their personal biases and how to avoid those at the workplace. And initially, DE&I really focused on treating everyone the same, almost the colorblind. I don't see color. That was kind of like, if you treat John this way, you treat Jeffrey the same way, despite if they might be different colors. And then the movement and diversity and equity issues keep, coming out through the court system. It was 1986 that the court recognized that sexual harassment was illegal, that was part of sex discrimination. And in 1990, the Americans with Disability Act passed, which held that you couldn't discriminate against disabled people as well. And so you see there's lots of laws that are coming out, and the businesses are wanting to be making sure that they are complying with the laws. But then there also starts to be research about why an inclusive work culture is so important. So everyone thought we're just complying with these laws, or not everyone, but some people thought we're just complying with these laws because they're laws, we don't want to break the law. But then when they did the research, they said, wow, when we have more ideas, more different thoughts, people of different backgrounds in the workplace, we actually get a better work product. There's actually better business decisions being made. Because if you have all men deciding on a product that's aimed for the general population, then you're not getting a woman's perspective, right? You're just getting one perspective. And so when we're having groups of people, different cultures, we're getting a better perspective.
I was going to say, so it's a lot to unpack. And if you're just tuning in, Kim Jacobsen is here, and I think doing an amazing job of outlining how we got to today, the history of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which at the core of it, I know I'm kind of going to make it very elementary here, Kim, but at the core of it, it was to really, in the workplace, hire people based on what they bring to the table, not the way they look, not their skin color, not their gender, not their sexuality, but what they bring to the workplace. Can they do the job effectively? Are they going to be a good team member to your team? That's really what DEI was created for.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so we had all these trainings going on, and then studied that in 2019, the Harvard Business Review did a study and found the trainings really did very little. They maybe had a little small impact for a very short amount of time, but it typically did not impact the people who held the power, which were typically white men, and it did very little to eliminate the bias. And so there was a thought about, how are we going to change things? And things like the Me Too movement started, Black Lives Matter, Stop AAPI Hate. And then in 2020, actually during the pandemic, the Supreme Court finally recognized the rights of LGBTQ people under Title VII as sex discrimination, so that you couldn't, up until 2020, the federal law, not the state law had covered them all along or for quite a while, but the federal law finally caught up to many states and said you can't not hire or fire someone because of their sexual orientation or because they're a transgender person. But the pandemic really put a lot of this DE&I concepts into light. We were home, first of all, during the pandemic, and what we noticed is this really had a disparate impact on people of color and women, because actually not everyone was home, right? A lot of people in the food service workers, in the service industries and, hospital care had to go to work, and we found a lot of the people who were most impacted and having to go to work were women and minorities. And then we had the issue of daycare, right? You had your kids in daycare, but all of a sudden your kids were home and you had to work. And how did this impact women? So it really brought a lot of things to light. And then we had George Floyd, right? And I think everyone was paused, and so paying more attention to this racism and social injustice that was always bubbling at the surface, but really bubbled over the surface.
So now I think we have a couple more minutes with Kim Jacobsen from the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities here in Connecticut, talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI, you hear it a lot, especially recently in the news in the last couple of years, and right now as we are looking ahead to the presidential election in November. I wanted to bring up some information because we're very divided, I would say, as a nation on this. If you look at a 2023 survey by the Pew Research Center, it found 52% of employed U.S. adults say they have DEI trainings or meetings at work. 61% of U.S. adults say their workplace have these policies in place, just focusing on fairness in hiring, promotions, or pay. And more than half of U.S. adults say focusing on increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion at work is mainly a good thing. However, there's the other half. Critics say DEI programs are discriminatory, an attempt to solve racial discrimination by disadvantaging other groups, particularly white Americans. So Here's my question for you, Kim. Again, at the core of this, I think that it's a good thing, right? I mean, I think it's I think a moral rather. It's our morals as humans to treat each other respectfully, to be kind to one another, to not judge each other based on the color of our skin versus the content of our character. You know, we hear about this and we should be living this way, but obviously that doesn't always happen in the workplace, which is why DEI was created. Do you feel, though, in 2024 that we are now so focused on overcorrecting wrongs of the past that has become more important than what is being brought to the table? So seeing workplaces or even colleges, for example, highlight that we have an Asian population, we have a minority population, we have this many women here, we have people from the LGBTQ community, and it then takes away from looking at, well, what are we bringing to the table versus, again, the color of your skin, content of your character, that comparison. Do you feel that we've overcorrected and that's where the controversy comes from?
I mean, I guess that's a matter of opinion, but I think there's an important concept that people should think about when they think about this issue. And I'm going to give you an example because I think it best illustrates this. And I always use lawyers because that's what I'm familiar with. I'm a lawyer. So say there's two law students, one that's white whose father was a lawyer, whose grandfather was a lawyer, who goes to country clubs and is exposed to lawyer, who maybe did a summer internship in college with a judge that his father knew, that doesn't have to work their way through law school, that has time to do all sorts of internships, and really has a lot of exposure. And say there is a black student that they're first generation law school, maybe even first generation going to college, and they got to work at 7-Eleven during the summer to, get money for gas to drive to law school, and they don't necessarily, have all those same connections, and they both, are in the workplace. They're really not on equal footing, and that's because of historical discrimination, not necessarily because anything either of them did. And there's this, it's an idea that it's not just equality, but equity, and we need to give people what they need. Does that mean preference in hiring? I guess that'll be for the Supreme Court to ultimately decide, if that is a legal concept or not. I think a lot of this is going to be resolved through the new election and the Supreme Court and what laws end up getting passed. But I think it's an important thing to think about and realize that not everyone starts with an even playing field. Just because there is more representation of different folks in the workplace, really at the top, the leadership, think about it this way. If Vice President Harris becomes the president, she's going to be breaking 2 glass ceilings all at once. But we're in 2024, and yet we have yet to have a woman be president. We have yet to have a woman of color be president. So I don't think we're quite there yet. That's my opinion. People probably will disagree. But I think it's important to kind of think about where we came from to understand where we can go in the future.
I also think, though, Kim, you start a really great conversation, which is, before you even get to the workplace or you get to after high school graduation, the focus on giving kids equal opportunity, because I do understand where the critics come from, where they say, why are let's just say you've got the average white American family who's like, okay, I worked really hard, I made a lot of money, I was able to put my kids through college, and yet they don't get the opportunity because they are what you call white privilege, for example. But when you look at that, how, I guess really the question is, why in the world do we even have that kind of division? Why aren't schools more up to par? Like I talk about this all the time here in Fairfield County, for example. Why do we have a Bridgeport when we've got a Stanford and a Norwalk that, to me, are in a totally different league when it comes to education and access to, things like even Wi-Fi. To me, Bridgeport is almost forgotten as even being part of Fairfield County, but it is. It's right there in the middle of it. So to me, it's bizarre that we don't address this more at the very early stages of life, so that by the time we get to college graduation or to high school graduation and college years in the workforce, there is more of an even playing field.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? I mean, like I
that.
agree with you. I see what you're saying. And again, I'm kind of confessing as the fact that, like, I guess if you want to call me white privileged, fine. But to me, I had parents who worked really hard. They're middle class Connecticut residents, worked really hard, needed a dual income to put us all through school, and they did. But I feel like what's wrong with this is the fact that all my classmates should have had the same opportunity I did, regardless of what their parents made for money, did for money. Every kid, especially if they're in public school, which is what I was in, if you're in public school, we should all be getting that opportunity to get the best kind of education this state has to offer. I mean, Fairfield kids should not be getting something exponentially different than Bridgeport kids. That to me is the breakdown.
And we could get into a whole nother discussion about how town government doesn't really serve our students very well, but maybe that's for another day, Melissa.
Right? I mean, I don't know. I just I'm thinking about that as you said that. I think that's a huge breakdown in that, but people don't. I don't think about that when you hear DEI. But I really appreciate you having this conversation. I know it's a controversial one, Kim, but I think, again, from an attorney standpoint and the commission standpoint, I think remembering the core of what it's about and really where that kind of comes from, I think is really important. So thank you. Thank you for having that chat with us here on WICC.
And thank you for being our partner in this, Melissa. We appreciate you as well.
Of course. Kim Jacobsen, again, with the Commission on Human Rights and